Now, COVID kind of, New Zealand, right? New Zealand was offered up to us 18 months ago as being the great example of close the borders, tighten the restrictions, zero COVID. I think at one point we had thousands of deaths, and I think New Zealand had something like 3 at one point in this calamitous, dreadful couple of years. Well, things are happening in New Zealand because of Ukraine and the cost of living crisis and all the other stuff that's making the news. We haven't really heard about it, but New Zealand has dropped just all of the COVID restrictions. There are masks still being worn indoors. So what's this all been about? Does this mean that the New Zealand policy worked and they've now got to a stage where they can do this? Or are they just kind of getting in sync with the rest of the world who are doing what we're doing now? And that is basically saying we've got to live with it from here on out. Let's check in with Rex Weiderstrom, journalist based in New Zealand. Rex, thank you for doing this. How are you?
Oh, very well, thank you. Enjoying an Indian summer here in New Zealand.
Oh, how nice. You know, I sometimes listen to the likes of News Talk ZB and various stations from there, and it's like you are listening to another world because you are so far away from us, and climatically you're different, and, you know, it's rather nice to have a break from this. But look, your Prime Minister, the person running your country was hailed as being somebody who was well ahead of the curve at the beginning of this COVID calamity by having a zero COVID policy, closing down the borders, even stopping people coming in from nearby Australia. And a lot of people were saying over here, that's the way to do it if you want to get rid of this dreadful bug that is threatening all of our lives. But now the restrictions are being dropped. So where is New Zealand at? What is this saying about the last 18 months, 2 years for you?
Well, the initial lockdowns that came in 2020, they certainly worked. We were COVID-free for 18 months. We were doing everything that we had done in 2019, and it seemed that we'd got on top of this and that this was a winning strategy. But then, as anybody who knows anything about viruses would have predicted, mutations come along, and those mutations have somehow figured out to get around those restrictions, and that's what's happened in this case. So we have, as you said, dropped all the restrictions virtually except masks indoors and limits on indoor gatherings, but they've been doubled to 200. And in the meantime, yesterday we had 12,882 new cases out of a population of just over 4 million and 11 deaths. We've now had 269 deaths in total from COVID. We've got 861 in hospital as of Monday. That's up on 848 the day before. So we are in the middle of an epidemic. And in the middle of this epidemic, we've thrown up our hands and said, we tried our best. That seems to be the way that the government's handling it now.
So Jacinda Ardern was hailed as being a great, heroine for the policy. Now, this has happened because you couldn't have sustained things, I wouldn't have thought, forever in that way. So, this has happened. Cases are now starting to rise, and you're looking at variants and all the rest of it. What's your media saying about this? Is your media branding the last... I mean, that's going to be very hard for people to take on board, but is your media branding this then all a failure?
Well, there's a lot of debate about the media in this country. One of the COVID measures that Jacinda Ardern introduced was to hand them out $55 million at a time when revenues were falling even before COVID came along. And there's an argument as to whether this is now affecting the way that they're reporting upon her and upon COVID in particular. And of course, there are, two sides to that debate. I don't come down on either of them because in the case of some media, I think that's undoubtedly the case, and in the other media, absolutely not. They've maintained their independence. But overall, I think the media are being very careful about the way they're reporting this because there is still a strong public feeling that we should still have the borders closed. We should turn our back on the rest of the world and live, as a former Prime Minister said, in our hermit kingdom. And the Prime Minister now is getting quite a lot of flack from the public for not continuing these very, very restrictive policies. So the media, who had initially supported them on the basis of their success, has now got its own credibility to think about. Hang on, we said this was a good idea. She's now sort of left us hanging. What's our position on it? And so the media really hasn't, I think, made up its own mind as to whether this is a good thing or not.
See, if I was an ordinary Joe there, At the beginning of this, I'd have been very impressed. I was listening from lockdown here to radio stations there, and I was thinking to myself, my God, they've got this thing nailed down, because they were putting out alerts on the radio there, as you will know, to say there have been some cases located in this area, and all of the effort was zeroing in on a tiny area. And I got the feeling then, events have changed now, and we see it in a different light through experience. But I got the feeling then that you were being looked after better than we were. It sounded like you had the whole thing nailed. And now it's looking like, maybe to some people in New Zealand, that it's all been a waste of suffering and effort and the mental trauma of being locked down and restricted that everybody's gone through. What do you say?
Well, the argument against that many people are making is, well, it could have been worse, but who knows, really, whether if we'd simply bitten the bullet as other countries did, including to some extent the UK, and said, look, this is inevitable, we just need to get through it. We seem to be about now 2 years behind everybody else in accepting the inevitability, experiencing the hospitalizations, the strain on the health system, and the deaths. So I don't think until we're really out the other end of this that we're going to be certain whether it was all worth it or not. But if you look at the business collapses that have happened, and I'm particularly aware of that because I have contacts in small business all over the place. I don't know. I don't know whether the business sector is ever going to recover. You've also got people now who, despite the lifting of restrictions, they're working from home. They're too scared to leave home. And so with the restrictions off, businesses are now looking around going, hang on, this isn't any different from lockdown. Our turnover hasn't lifted. Our customer numbers haven't gone up. Will we ever see the numbers that we need to sustain ourselves come back? And that's in some cases looking doubtful.
Well, that sounds like a mess. And it's a political it's a political conundrum that your government is going to have to sort out, because that is not a situation that people are going to be happy with at all. Can I ask you about one thing? My producer Hayley found this today, so all credit to her. I've worked with an awful lot of New Zealanders over the years, and, Kiwis are wonderful people to work with. They're, happy-go-lucky often, and they have a great outlook on life. I know I'm trying to encapsulate the entire nation in this way, but, I like New Zealanders. So I was very surprised to discover some statistics today, pointed out to me by my producer Hayley, that police in New Zealand, and I've watched those TV programmes that air in the middle of the night here about New Zealand traffic cops looking like a really decent bunch of people and all of that stuff. They appear to be, from some statistics that I've seen here, trigger happy is one word that might be used. New Zealand police apparently kill at 11 times the rate of police in England and Wales, and New Zealand police have killed 39 people since 1990. And bearing in mind where we're talking about, this is not Chicago or, South Africa or somewhere like that. The police in England have fatally shot 77 people over that time, twice as many in New Zealand, but of course the population is different. What are people saying about this?
Well, again, two schools of thought, because we're now more and more so a very disparate and divided country. And so you have your law and order people who think there's nothing wrong with this, and these people brought it on themselves, and the police are merely defending themselves. But those, I think, are the people who haven't delved into the cases. Just to give you an example, one case was a 29-year-old mentally ill young man, known to be mentally ill. So presumably the police were given this information. He approached them with a machete. Now, obviously, that's not a long-range weapon. Mm-hmm. You've got to get close enough to use it. They have tasers. They have the option of withdrawing. They have all sorts of other de-escalation strategies available. Instead, they started shooting. Now, they put 4 bullets into him. He turned around and dropped the machete and started running away. They fired 8 more shots, including one that hit him in the back, whilst he was trying to, obviously, as you would, evade this hail of gunfire. Then, when it came to be investigated, investigate it. There was some footage from the police helicopter, and they were allowed to see it by the investigating officers before they were interviewed. And they very handily noticed that there was a point where the police helicopter view was obscured by a tree, and so then their evidence was that, well, he then thrust at us with this machete at this very point that you can't see it, unfortunately. And that could be the truth, but
right. I mean,
we're never going to know
this
if
sounds
that
to
was or
me
not.
then, if there's much of this stuff going on, and these numbers speak for themselves, that there's a training issue here, isn't there?
There is, but they don't get very much weapons training. I don't know how much you get in the UK, but generally, I think, from what I know,
More,
of
I think, than they did.
services. Yeah, and I think they all need more, no matter where they are. I've read this about the US too. There's when you look at the amount of training on other things versus shooting, there's not a lot of it. And they've shot, in fact, an innocent bystander before on the Auckland motorway. They were aiming at somebody else altogether, and he had nothing to do with the case. So obviously they can't aim very well, and that would suggest training. But also there's a mindset amongst the New Zealand police, and this is somebody, an expert, put a police culture that puts a risk ahead of de-escalation. And, it's the adrenaline rush. We're in a high-speed chase. They've killed many, many young people who have stolen a car. Now, it's just a car at the end of the day. If they take it and burn it out, the insurance company will pay out. I'm not excusing stealing cars, don't get me wrong, but it's a car. And they've killed, teenagers, because it's usually teenagers that get up to this stuff, by flicking on the lights and the sirens, and yay, we're in the middle of a chase.
So there's
a
cultural thing here. It's just, from our point of view, we don't normally get to hear these stories in the United Kingdom. And I always think of New Zealand as being a lovely, safe place where nothing bad happens. But of course, bad things do happen. I had a colleague that I worked with, you might even remember this case, and we can't talk about it now, but I'll just reflect it. Things like this do happen in New Zealand. I had a colleague who was a newsreader with me when I worked for independent radio news across the United Kingdom in the 90s. And he went to live his dream. His name was Philip Cottrell. And he lived, I think, and worked in Christchurch for the national broadcaster there, the equivalent of the BBC. He lived his dream. He was very happy. And he was beaten to death on his way home from work one night. And that thing, I think that story shocked New Zealand. But up to that point, I never believed that anything like that happened in New Zealand. And I know that Philip went to live there because he thought the lifestyle would be nicer and safer than here. So it just goes to show, doesn't it? Thank you very much, Rex, for that window on New Zealand, and I wish you well.